Hi, everyone. Hey. So Timo gave us a very inspiring way of thinking about how we can be different on a very kind of macro high level. What I'm going to be doing is giving you a little micro drill down into one topic and one way you can set yourself apart with tone of voice. Hi everyone, I'm Laura, and I'm a content strategist at Reaktor. Like Timo said, everything sounds better with strategy in it. So I help our teams and our clients figure out how they can do more with content and how they can use tone of voice to their advantage. Now, I know that the original program said I'd be talking about both tone of voice and content strategy, but my inner editor then kicked in and told me to cut it back. So instead of trying to tell you everything I know, I'll be talking about how you can set your digital service apart with just tone of voice. And if you are really kind of looking forward into that kind of content strategy bit, do come and grab me afterward and we can have a chat. Okay, so let's get stuck in. Let's see if I can use the clicker. Here we go. So tone of voice is one of those topics that kind of periodically just pops up. Someone writes an article or someone gives a speech, and we all kind of discuss it for a little bit. And it seems like we're all in agreement. Tone of voice is important. Yet it feels like sometimes it's a little bit hard to actually bring it into practice. So how can we do this, and what does it require? There's a misconception that tone of voice is just this: witty and fantastic and fun. This here is Poncho, a weather app who serves up your daily forecast with a side of puns and pop culture references. And I love Poncho. Poncho's great. I would love to have this writer's job. But tone of voice can also be this: a little bit more subtle, less punny, but just as important. On your left, there's Todoist, so that's my to-do app of choice. And when you reach the end of your task list, it gives you a little encouragement. You're all done for today. It could have just been a boring no tasks or 0 tasks. Instead, it just makes you feel a little bit elated. On the right, there's Airbnb. Who doesn't know Airbnb? And it's fairly kind of functional. It does what it needs to. But if you look at the very last line, it says, who's coming? It could say guests. Any normal hotel would say guests. But Airbnb, with its community spirit, phrases it this way. These examples are quite subtle. They're very purposeful. They're not very fancy. But they still convey an emotion and a personality. Now for something completely different. This is gov.uk, which is the UK digital service that collects all government services into one. So this is where you go for your pensions and where you go for your driver's license, etc., etc. And this also has a tone of voice, and is actually a very, very good one. It's dry, yes. It's informative, absolutely. But it fits the service and it fits the use. It makes difficult things easier to understand. In fact, I think all services have a tone of voice. Sometimes that tone of voice is intentional, and sometimes it's not. My aim is to actually make sure that all services have an intentional tone of voice. And it's not just the Ponchos of the world that need a tone of voice. It's every single service. And it's actually most important when you get into fields like finance or healthcare, where it can make a real difference. An important thing to note, tone of voice should never ever get in the way of actually using your product. Obviously, the thing that we all know is that people use their services for a reason. There's a task that they come to do. And that task can either be utilitarian, like booking a flight or paying a bill, or it can be more nebulous, like I want to learn something new, or I want to be entertained. So there's some ground rules that you need before you get started. These ones that I'm going to be showing next are actually by John Duratsky from Google Ventures. I think he wrote them down in like 2013. but they still apply. So you need to make it clear. You want your words to actually communicate something, so don't get in the way of yourself. You want to be specific. So if you actually mean confirm your payment, say that instead of okay. Watch for jargon and abbreviations. And this one's actually super important if you're internal, because it's very easy to kind of let your internal speak kind of leak into the real world. Put the important stuff first. This is so that your copy is scannable by the user, but it also makes it easier to cut it back when it gets too long. And 5 is don't be lazy. There's so many services that use buttons that say OK and cancel when they could say something else entirely. And that's actually one of those spots where you can really start putting your tone of voice to use. It's important to do these things, but also you can do these things and still have a personality in it. What I'm going to be showing is some very practical steps you can take into having a tone of voice that's intentional and functional and that does things for your user. These are kind of principles that we all know. They're principles we use in other areas of design, but sometimes tone of voice kind of slips away and we forget about it. So this is just about kind of putting these same ideas into use when you're designing a tone of voice. I'm going to go deeper into each of these, but just to give you an idea. So the first one is the brand. Then there's the emotional context of your users. Third is obviously the task that they've come to your service to accomplish. Number 4 is the confidence level that they have around that task. And finally, it's about preparing for the unexpected. Onward. So unless you're building a product or service from scratch, and that product or service is the prime instance of your brand, you probably have a set tone of voice as part of your brand book. Obviously, it kind of sets the boundaries within which you'll play, but there's certain things that you can do with that. So, what is tone of voice? It's the way we sound and speak. But what your tone of voice guideline probably doesn't set out for you is the register of your language. How do we speak? In which instance? I sound very different to my mother than I do to my doctor or a client, and I choose a different register befitting each of those situations. And the same idea should go for each brand. Here's an example. This is Volkswagen. So their tone of voice says they're authentic, human, open, appealing, and clear. The one on the far left is from their sales catalog. So it says things like slip into the ergonomic command center of the CC and use its push button start to access luxury, technology, and entertainment. Then we get the website interface, which is much more utilitarian, but still has that same kind of fun human vibe with it. And third, we've got their social media. Same tone of voice, different context, different register. That's tone of voice. The emotional context also plays in to how you speak to your users. This is very simply, how are your users using the service and how are they feeling? A tone that is too distant from the emotion we feel is jarring. If the user is feeling worried, the service shouldn't be too fun and light-hearted. Or if the user is bored, you probably shouldn't go for super formal. Next is obviously, how would you like them to feel? Would you like them to go from angry to soothed, unwell to feeling like you're taken care of, bored to entertained, stressed to feeling more in control? I believe that tone of voice is one of those things that can actually help you bridge the gap. Other areas of design do as well, obviously, but tone of voice can kind of be the cherry on top. And you do that with word choice, by thinking about what the user's worried about or what they want to accomplish, and then making sure that your tone of voice at least doesn't get them agitated. Interesting things happen when you take that emotion and then think about the task at hand. That's really where your tone of voice can actually make a big difference. For example, this is where you get things like feeling angry and someone leaving a review. Your tone of voice in that case probably should not kind of annoy the user anymore, And it's probably the single worst place to also ask them to leave an app review or to sign up to a newsletter. Another example would be when you're feeling bored and you want to be entertained. Your tone of voice can already kind of get them into the right frame of mind by being entertaining and applying some of those ways of thinking into that tone of voice. Or it could be about feeling poorly and having to book a doctor's appointment. Here's Oma Mehiläinen, which is an app for one of the biggest healthcare providers in Finland. And thinking about that user's context when they're feeling sick and they need to book an appointment was one of the considerations when we started creating the interface copy for this. How can we keep the instructions clear and short so users can move on to actually booking their appointment and then starting to feel better? And here, instead of going for something like choose patient, the copy is much more straightforward. Who is this appointment for? This is especially important for one of the core audiences, families with children, who would actually have lots of people added into the same app. So with this, we just wanted to make sure that the people could get on with booking the appointment and then they could start feeling better sooner. Point number 4, what is your user's confidence level? Once we know how the user is feeling and what they'd like to accomplish, next we'll consider how they're approaching it. Something like a doctor's appointment is fairly straightforward and run-of-the-mill, but then there are things that are harder. You ask yourself, is your user ready to breeze through it, or do they need a little hand-holding? And you might just find that you actually have lots of different kinds of users, especially with more complex services. So how do you start catering to those multiple different contexts? Here's one way we did it with a service for a financial services company that guided users through a multi-step task that had lots and lots of sub-tasks and lots of different kinds of users. So before doing actually kind of any visual design or even interface design, we identified from some reports we had on the users 3 different confidence levels that they had. The one on the top were feeling quite confident. They knew what they were doing. They'd probably done it before, and they just wanted to get on with it. Then we had a second group in the middle. They were feeling okay, but they did want some tips along the way to help them and make sure that they were getting it right. And then we had a third group who'd never done this task before. They had lots of fraught feelings around it and wanted as much help as possible. So what we did was we created different kinds of content for these levels, as well as a structure that allowed the confidence to simply browse and skip, while some content was behind a click for those who really wanted it. So the second level of confidence got everything that the first level got, plus some extra, and so on and so forth. Then we took those confidence levels and thought about how that affects the tonality and the format of the content. So we made sure that the bulk of it was easy to scan and had clear CTAs so that the breezies could just get through it, while we made sure that any guidance that we gave was actually very easy to act on. So it was do this, don't do that, and in plain language to reduce any felt stress by that third group. How did we put it into more practice? So this is how that happened. We actually mapped out each piece of content that already existed onto color-coded post-its per step in the service and then per confidence level. And what we could very kind of quickly see was that we weren't really serving the users who were feeling a bit wobbly. There were lots of gaps. Then we could actually take and kind of put our content creation efforts on those parts and create a content plan that really served all of our users. So it's really important to remember that a good tone of voice is accessible to your target audience or your target audiences, and that all the content you've created is serving all of them. So double check with tools like that post-it task that your tone of voice is in fact doing what it's meant to be doing. And it's serving all of them, not just the worrywarts or the easy breezies. Finally, what do you say when something goes wrong? This is, as you guessed it, error messages. And they are the single most important pieces of copy in your service, I'd wager. Because that's really when you can either lose your user or really get them on board again. The problem with kind of error messages as they stand in lots of services is they can be written in a hurry and they can sometimes be a bit of an afterthought. And I have seen someone say that, well, the best error message is the one that never gets seen, but that's fairly utopistic. That doesn't really happen. So if they do, after all of your hard work, end up getting an error message, let's make sure it's as good as the rest of the service. There are some few principles that we can put to work here. Number one, be human. In most cases, sounding robotic or unemotive when someone's feeling frustrated or they've encountered an issue is a bad idea. So strive for a human touch. And error messages can be kind of fun bits of copy. So they don't have to always be, the red X and make you feel awful about what's just happened. It can just be that you go into a shopping bag and it's empty, and we can make that experience a little bit more fun. Number two, be helpful. This is kind of, fairly obvious. When something goes wrong, offer ways that they can actually rectify that situation. Number three, humor is allowed. It's a tricky subject. Often it's a good idea to be a little humorous, especially if the error that your user has encountered isn't a grave one. However, if they've just lost 15 minutes of work, you might want to kind of dial it back a little bit. So just understand the context there as well. And number four, final one, is be humble. You messed up or they messed up, it doesn't really matter who it was. Just kind of own up to it and say you're sorry. That's often the best course of action in most things. And what's interesting is these four principles are actually the same principles that get applied to crisis communications. So you can really think about error messages as just being crisis communications on a very, very micro level. All right. I wanted to make this as actionable as possible. So if you're ready to get started, here are some things that you can start doing. So when you're thinking about the context of the task and the emotional context of the user, also consider tone of voice. If you're lucky to have a writer on your project, it's great to start having those discussions with them already at the very beginning, as early on as you can, and just get them kind of involved in that discussion. If you don't have a writer, don't worry. I believe we can all write. So just think about the tone of voice while you're thinking about the rest of the design as well. Number two is to actually do the confidence level content exercise. So figure out what kinds of users you have and what kinds of content could actually serve them and how that content should sound. And consider how then those levels can affect the way you speak. Number three, write some amazing error messages, even if you think your user will never see them. And make sure that they're human, humble, helpful, and perhaps even a little bit humorous. That's it. Get writing. Thank you.
Just a question about translations and other languages. So there's a lot of translation agencies out there that will do technical translations, which is what it is. How do you retain the art and the craft in what you verbalize? It was a very, very good presentation. How do you do that when you start the translation process?
That's very tricky. I mean, there's considerations like budget and timing that often make it difficult, but ideally you'd want to work with actual copywriters. If you can't work with a local copywriter, then I'd definitely make sure that you work with a translation agency that can actually provide context for the translator. So I know that some of the big translation agencies, like you just get an Excel basically as a translator, and you don't know where that copy is going. So just providing some actual interface images with that, showcasing where the copy goes, providing some of that guidance, and then making sure that all of that material actually gets to the translator would be, the best way I think to handle it. Often going with a smaller translation agency or a freelancer gives you a bit more flexibility around that. Good question. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, you had the example where you had 3 user groups, and
Yes.
you said that it was one of your projects.
Mhm.
So was it so that when the user downloads the app, you ask the question, what is your confidence level? They choose, and then the app will just restructures itself? Or how did it go in kind of further steps?
Sure, that's actually a really good question. This was actually a service that was a responsive website, so it was a responsive web service. We did not explicitly ask about the confidence level. Instead, what we did together with the interface designer and the visual designer was then create a kind of a visual structure to the content that made it easy for those who kind of knew what they wanted to skip through it. So an example was that we did lots of checklists for the people who worried a lot. And those were kind of clearly color-coded throughout the service. So people fairly quickly, we found, could kind of identify the bits that were relevant to kind of their confidence level without us having to make it explicit.
So everything was present there?
Everything was present. Some of it was behind a click, so there was a couple of accordions where you actually had to click it open. But most of it was kind of visible, but just structured in a way that made it easy to skim.
Hi, thanks for a nice presentation. I was thinking of do you have like different kinds of tasks, which would be typical that you are writing for? So I was thinking whole presentation. So what I'm writing mostly is like design communication, and then I think that's like mostly sales pitch. So you are trying to communicate the value of stuff and how it benefits people. I do human-centered design.
Yeah.
So, and then I picked from the presentation another thing like this error messages. So that's in a way a task type. So do you have different contexts and tasks for which you often write, and can you elaborate on this like a spontaneous?
Sure, I can give it a go.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think that kind of goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning about tone and register. So the fact that depending on your context, you take a different register with your tone of voice. So error messages are a definite one that you encounter in any service. Another kind of, off the top of my head, another thing that we often end up looking at is terminology. So what do we call different bits of our service? And that's a tricky one. And that goes back to translation as well. What do we do when we translate those terms? So how do we name a certain section? How do we name a certain functionality, for example? A third clear, distinct thing that you have to write for is often onboarding, especially if you're writing for apps. So how do you make sure that you communicate the value of what your service does to a user before they actually get to use it? And maybe the fourth one is a fairly kind of easy to miss one, which is CTAs. So how do you make sure that your calls to action are kind of uniform across a service? I hope this answers.
Yeah? Great answer.
Oh,
Thanks.
great.
I think maybe brand of like an aggregator selling service like Zalando or Amazon, it aggregates a lot of really strong brands in itself. So if you have an example, and how do they get there to be strong?
So how does the aggregator get to be as strong? That's actually a very good question. I mean, Amazon, like you said, is a great example of that. I think Amazon has a strong tone of voice themselves. It's quite utilitarian, so I think it's hard to kind of sometimes notice that. I think it comes across especially in services like, or in smaller Amazon services like Kindle, for example, where you've obviously got very strong, not brands, but tones of voice because they're creative works that kind of aggregates into itself. So I think it's a difficult thing to do, is to aggregate and surround yourself around other brands in a way that isn't kind of stepping on their toes, if that makes sense. But I'm really having trouble thinking of one off the top of my head, to be honest. But I'll have a little think and come back to you if I come up with one. Thank you.